Beijing has responded to Donald Trump's apparent U-turn in their escalating trade war.
Jim Farley, CEO of Ford Motor Company, recently addressed the company's ongoing financial difficulty following a dramatic shift in U.S. trade policy. Donald Trump, the freshly elected president, had hardly settled into office when he proposed massive tariffs on important trading partners. The move struck shockwaves through the global economic landscape, and Ford, with its vast foreign influence, was quickly enmeshed in the aftermath. The tariffs, which were intended to encourage American production by penalizing foreign competitors, instead made American goods prohibitively expensive in other countries, thereby locking Ford out of important international markets. Before we begin, please hit the like and subscribe buttons for future updates. Ford's business model, like many other big American automakers, is based not only on domestic sales, but also on strong worldwide demand. For decades, Ford has built strong relationships with buyers all across the world, from bustling European capitals to rising markets in Asia and South America. Vehicles designed and manufactured in the United States were exported, balancing domestic sales and mitigating local economic swings. However, the price hikes caused by tariffs have rendered Ford automobiles uncompetitive in overseas markets. Buyers who used to throng to Ford showrooms worldwide began moving to local and more affordable competitors, pinching Ford's income streams and putting the corporation in a vulnerable financial position. Jim Farley's remarks offered a bleak picture of the internal instability that has engulfed Ford's executive and financial departments. As international demand dried up, the corporation faced a series of cascading issues. Inventory accumulated in ports and warehouses as cars intended for export no longer found purchasers. This surplus inventory put a pressure on Ford's logistics and warehousing budgets, which were already fine-tuned for normal operations. Cash flow, the lifeblood of any manufacturing conglomerate, began to constrict. Plants that had previously worked on reliable production schedules were forced to slow down, and in some cases stop totally, resulting in a backlog that compounded financial constraints. The tariffs had not simply reduced sales, they also dramatically boosted Ford's operating costs. Key commodities such as aluminum and steel, which are critical to vehicle manufacturing, were suddenly more expensive to import. Although the intention was to boost local production of these materials, the American supply chain was unable to scale up quickly enough to satisfy demand, resulting in soaring input costs. Ford's vehicles got more expensive to make just as they became more difficult to sell. This perfect storm of dwindling revenue and soaring expenses put Ford in a financial bind. Tough deliberations took place behind closed doors in Ford's executive circles. To stay viable, the company needed to contemplate drastic cost-cutting measures. Layoffs, factory closures, and reduced R&D funding were in the future. These possible measures were especially unpleasant because they contradicted Ford's recent plans to extend its electric vehicle lineup and invest in self-driving technology. Ford had been crafting a daring new future only a few months prior. Now it was fighting for survival in the present. The consequences of Ford's financial woes went beyond the corporation itself. Ford is a mainstay of the American car industry, and its troubles have had an impact on the economy as a whole. Suppliers who relied on Ford contracts experienced their own income problems. Dealerships, already struggling with low inventory turnover, saw earnings disappear. Even the local economy that surrounded Ford's manufacturing plants braced for the impact, with restaurants, realtors, and service providers preparing for a downturn. The stock market reacted quickly and viciously. Investors, frightened of the uncertainties surrounding Ford, began selling off shares, lowering the company's market value. Credit rating agencies were keenly monitoring the situation, with the threat of a downgrade looming. A lower credit score would raise Ford's borrowing rates, making it even more difficult for the firm to weather the storm. Financial analysts examined Ford's balance sheets and cautioned that unless the business could quickly change, it faced a genuine risk of long-term deterioration. Jim Farley's public admission of the company's terrible situation was significant, not only for its candor, but also for the urgency it portrayed. Ford, once a symbol of American economic strength, now represented the unexpected effects of aggressive protectionist policies. Tariffs, supposed to revitalize American manufacturing, instead suffocated it. In a closely integrated global economy, Ford's situation served as a clear reminder that no corporation, no matter how huge or historic, is immune to the consequences of high-level government policy decisions. As Ford hurried to establish a strategy, it considered a variety of possibilities for mitigating the harm. One option was to shift more production offshore to avoid tariffs entirely. A painful irony given the nationalist ethos that generated the tariffs in the first place. Building automobiles closer to major markets may help preserve international sales, but such a shift would take time, money, and the willingness to rethink decades of operational planning. Ford also considered releasing new, lower-cost models designed exclusively for international markets. However, the viability of such a move was dubious given the company's troubled finances. Another key problem was maintaining employee morale during a period of high instability. Ford's staff, a proud and integral part of corporate success, was suddenly plagued with worry. Rumors of job layoffs and industrial closures spread more frequently. Employee involvement, a vital determinant in productivity and innovation, fell as uncertainty spread. Farley and his executive team had to strike a fine balance between transparency and reassurance, which was practically impossible given the gravity of the situation. International partners and governments also responded, with some expressing displeasure and disappointment with the proposed American taxes. Long-standing economic partnerships, based on decades of cooperation and mutual benefit, were strained. Ford faced not only economic challenges, but also political ramifications in major markets, including Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Governments in these nations began retaliating with their own levies, hampering Ford's efforts to remain profitable abroad. Ford's troubles with the new tariffs highlighted a fundamental conflict at the heart of modern globalization. While protectionist measures attempted to safeguard domestic sectors from foreign competition, they also disrupted the complicated supply chains and customer networks that corporations like Ford relied on. The automotive industry, probably more than any other sector, flourished on international cooperation, with parts imported from all over the world, manufactured in multiple nations, and sold globally. Ford's dilemma demonstrated how deeply ingrained globalization had become, and how disruptive even well-intended measures to reverse it might be. The company's financial troubles rekindled disputes in the business sector about the role of government involvement in the marketplace. Some executives and economists claimed that Ford's plight was a warning against overly aggressive trade strategies. They argued that, despite its flaws, the free market remained the most effective system for allocating resources and encouraging innovation. Others, however, argued that a rebalancing was required to safeguard American jobs and sectors from unfair foreign practices. Ford's struggle became a focal point in this greater ideological war, with commentators on all sides using it to support their perspectives. Internally, Ford's financial staff conducted a comprehensive assessment of expenses, looking for any possible way to save money. Non-essential projects were stopped, hiring freezes were imposed, and discretionary spending was reduced. The company's leadership was faced with difficult decisions regarding which ventures to keep and which to discontinue. Investments in electric vehicles and novel mobility solutions, which were formerly viewed as crucial to Ford's future, suddenly contended for precious resources with the urgent need to stabilize the firm. Jim Farley's leadership during this situation drew severe scrutiny. Leading a firm through a financial crisis requires not only smart thinking, but also effective communication and resilient leadership. Farley's desire to face the matter full-on, rather than sugarcoat the difficulties, garnered him some plaudits despite the rising uneasiness. Nonetheless, the path ahead was loaded with peril, and Farley's ability to steer the firm through these choppy seas would eventually define his reputation at Ford. Amidst the chaos, there were glimmers of hope. Ford's domestic brand loyalty remained relatively strong, bolstered by patriotic appeals and a client base that continued to buy American. Certain product lines, including trucks and SUVs, have performed quite well in the U.S. market, providing a possible lifeline. Ford also aimed to use its financial services subsidiary, Ford Credit, to offer new financing alternatives that may boost sales despite larger economic difficulties. However, these silver linings could not conceal the gravity of Ford's troubles. The overall macroeconomic environment exhibited symptoms of cooling, with consumer confidence ebbing and capital markets tightening. Rising interest rates increased the cost of financing vehicles, further depressing demand. Inflationary pressures reduced disposable earnings, making customers more hesitant about large purchases such as automobiles. In this scenario, Ford's financial woes threatened to worsen unless quick action was taken. During this time, Ford's competitors kept a careful eye on the unfolding drama. Some, notably foreign automakers with a larger local production presence in certain locations, expected to benefit from Ford's reduced position. Others, experiencing similar tariff-related issues, sympathized with Ford's predicament. The automotive sector as a whole found itself navigating a more fragmented and turbulent global market, in which long-held assumptions about trade and commerce were no longer valid. Jim Farley and his management team knew that Ford's survival required more than tactical changes. It necessitated a comprehensive overhaul of the company's strategy. Ford could no longer rely solely on its brand legacy or historical momentum. Innovation, agility, and the courage to make difficult but necessary adjustments would be required. The mission was huge, and the stakes could not be higher. Ford's future, and hence a large piece of American industrial heritage, hung in the balance as the corporation struggled to adapt to a completely new global order. Ford confronted more than just a corporate dilemma. It was a microcosm of a greater national and global struggle with the challenges of modern trade. President Trump's tariffs had set off a chain reaction, the full extent of which was just now becoming clear. Ford's immediate priority was survival. Ford's problems taught the globe a harsh lesson about the interconnectivity of economies and the unforeseen repercussions of even the best-intentioned initiatives. As Jim Farley sounded the alarm, it was evident that the journey ahead would be long, arduous, and unpredictable, with no assurances of success. Following Ford's escalating financial crisis, a profound sense of urgency spread throughout the company's sprawling network of executives, managers, and assembly workers. While the initial waves of difficulty focused on external sales and input costs, the deeper Ford dug into the roots of its problems, the more structural and systemic the vulnerabilities became. It became clear that tariffs were only the trigger. What was now happening was a reckoning with years of accumulated reliance on fluid, predictable global commerce networks that had abruptly become chaotic and hazardous. The design teams were also sucked into the fray. Ford's most recent models were designed with worldwide appeal in mind, catering to the differing regulatory and aesthetic tastes of many nations. However, the additional tariffs rendered many of these designs commercially unfeasible. Vehicles that had been precisely developed for the European or Asian markets were suddenly priced beyond reach for local buyers. Redesigning models just for the domestic US audience would be a complex turnaround. It necessitated large investments in retooling and marketing, which Ford could not afford as their margins shrank dangerously. Meanwhile, Ford's financial modeling teams were compelled to abandon estimates and assumptions that had guided the company's planning for years. Cost forecasting became nearly impossible, since material prices moved dramatically from week to week based on political developments. Tariffs infused volatility into the system, rendering months-old budgets useless, necessitating continual modifications and introducing a level of operational unpredictability that harmed staff morale and strained managerial attention. One of the most dangerous consequences emerged in the sphere of international collaborations. Ford had spent decades forming joint ventures and connections with international manufacturers and distributors. These ties were crucial for navigating local markets, meeting regulatory requirements, and adapting offers to consumer preferences. Those same partners now saw Ford as increasingly toxic, a liability in an atmosphere where connection with American-made products resulted in higher prices and political scrutiny. Some partners began cutting orders, renegotiating contracts with tougher terms, or surreptitiously moving their focus to competitor enterprises seen to be less politically charged. The situation deteriorated further when financial institutions tightened their assistance. Ford has previously had favorable terms with banks and investors, relying on its brand and generally predictable cash flows to acquire financing and fund ambitious projects. But as the financial strain became more visible and headlines about Ford's problems dominated business news, lenders became wary, access to affordable capital narrowed, and Ford faced the unthinkable prospect of having to offer higher yields or collateral to raise funds, squeezing them even further financially. Ford's global workforce, which had previously been linked by a shared sense of purpose and pride, began to split under stress. Workers in many nations, who were affected differently by the crisis, became resentful. In the United States, fears of mass layoffs were widespread, particularly among unionized workers who had fought hard for job security. Rumors about divestment and shutdowns circulated at abroad plants. Ford's leadership faced an almost impossible task: maintaining cohesion and loyalty among a workforce that was becoming increasingly nervous, skeptical, and in some cases, openly antagonistic to management. The crisis revealed Ford's vulnerability not only to tariffs, but also to larger upheavals in the global political climate. Nationalist fervor was not limited to the United States. Countries throughout the world began to create their own barriers in response to America's protectionist policies. Local governments, under pressure to protect their industries, imposed subsidies for native automakers or raised regulatory barriers for foreign corporations such as Ford. As a result, Ford faced an increasing number of challenges even in markets where tariffs were not directly involved, complicating their path forward. The tremendous technological innovations that are sweeping the automotive industry have added another layer of difficulty. While Ford faced immediate financial and logistical challenges, it could not afford to ignore the ongoing electric vehicle revolution. Rivals, both old and new, were investing billions in battery technology, self-driving cars, and new modes of transportation. Ford's financial difficulties meant they feared falling behind in a race that would define the industry's future. Investing in innovation became both vital and elusive, since each dollar had to be meticulously tracked. Internally, a discussion raged concerning Ford's strategic identity. Should Ford rely on a rebirth of home patriotism to retain its American legacy, or should it try to rebuild itself as a more agile, internationally integrated, technology-driven company? The leadership found itself caught between these two ideals, with no clear road forward and insufficient resources to pursue either completely. Every option entailed considerable danger. Each delay exacerbated the damage. The growing scandal also affected Ford's connections with state and local governments in the United States. Communities that had welcomed Ford facilities with tax breaks and infrastructure investments now wanted assurances that the firm would stay and that jobs would be safeguarded. Ford executives, while sympathetic, found it increasingly difficult to make promises they were not confident they could follow. Public trust, once one of Ford's most valuable assets, began to deteriorate. During the upheaval, Ford's marketing divisions faced an existential crisis. How can you market things to a worldwide audience that is gradually losing faith in American goods? Traditional messaging about durability, dependability, and innovation felt hollow in the face of trade conflicts and rising prices. Attempts to rename or reposition the corporation were generally regarded with skepticism. Consumers were considering not only product attributes, but also the larger geopolitical ramifications of their decisions. Analysts in financial reporting began to speculate that Ford could eventually have to explore strategic divestitures or the sale of units in order to stabilize its balance sheets. Some suggested that Ford sell off its more profitable commercial vehicle operations to shelter them from the weakening consumer market. Others proposed stronger alliances with tech behemoths or private equity firms. But such steps would represent a drastic and humiliating retreat from Ford's historic independence. The environment at the company's renowned headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan, was one of constant pressure and discomfort. Longtime employees who had been through past industry crises noted that even during the 2008 financial crash, there was a clearer route to recovery. This time, the opponent was amorphous, a dynamic interplay of political directives, market reactions, and international rivalries. It was a war for relevance as much as survival. The psychological impact on Ford's leadership team was substantial. Meetings lasted late into the night, with harsh judgments and painful decisions. Every strategy session began with a grim assessment of budgetary shortages and operational challenges. However, hope was not completely abandoned. However, it became a cautious, measured hope, tempered by a keen understanding of how quickly fortunes may collapse if the geopolitical picture continued to turn negatively. Ford's supply network, another pillar of its former strength, also buckled under the strain. Suppliers that had previously relied on Ford's consistent demand were suddenly looking for new clients or risking bankruptcy. In certain circumstances, Ford had to intervene directly to support crucial suppliers, putting an additional and unexpected strain on its financial resources. The sophisticated web of relationships that supported the contemporary car sector proved startlingly unstable when confronted with the centrifugal forces unleashed by protectionism. The emotional dimension of Ford's issue was perhaps best exemplified by its loyal customers. Across America and around the world, countless people who had grown up with Ford vehicles as part of their family life watched with anguish and confusion as the firm struggled. Brand loyalty, long an almost unbreakable asset, was now under jeopardy as customers questioned if Ford could continue to deliver the quality and dependability they expected in such turbulent times. Ford's collapse had a cultural impact that extended from television advertising to popular music. Ford trucks had long been associated with rugged Americana, a symbol of perseverance and hard work. But when the company's financial problems worsened, the symbolism became strained. Artists, advertisers, and critics began to reinterpret Ford's image, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes critically, but nearly always recognizing the enormous transition taking place. The international media pounced on Ford's woes as a powerful emblem of American fragility. Ford's troubles were frequently depicted in the European press as evidence of the limits of American economic strength in a globalized world. In Asian markets, commentators examined the company's mistakes with clinical detachment, teaching domestic companies about the dangers of over-reliance on American relationships. Ford had unknowingly become a global case study in the unforeseen implications of sudden geopolitical developments. As Ford navigated these hazardous seas, it confronted the sobering truth that recovery, if it happened at all, would most certainly take years. The short-term options were all painful: significant restructuring, withdrawal from global markets, or seeking government aid, all of which carried their own dangers and reputational consequences. Long-term survival required a thorough overhaul of the company's operations, identity, and worldwide strategy. Some factions within Ford began to believe that by downsizing, the business might expand again. This bold approach would entail intentionally withdrawing from particular markets and segments to conserve resources, focusing on core strengths, and rebuilding gradually. However, carrying out such a strategy would necessitate exceptional discipline, patience, and the ability to bear short-term pain in the expectation of long-term reward. A huge order in a highly competitive and continually changing sector. Throughout this, Jim Farley's involvement was important. His leadership was both challenged and defined by how he approached these problems. He rapidly formed crisis management teams, hired external advisors, and spoke openly with staff and stakeholders. He saw that restoring faith, both internally and publicly, would be critical, even if the efforts Ford needed to take were unpopular or difficult. The answers to these concerns remained unanswered, while Ford dealt with the immediate consequences of its financial crisis. However, it was clearly evident that the company's fate would serve as a vital bellwether, not only for the future of American industry, but also for the world economy as a whole, which was navigating a period of deep upheaval and struggle. The conflict was titanic, the stakes were historic, and the outcome was far from certain. Ford's internal troubles worsened as the company's financial situation became more complex and intertwined. The problem had progressed beyond a simple financial challenge. It was now a multifaceted crisis that included company identity, technology adaptability, labor relations, and global perception. Every aspect of the organization had been impacted, resulting in a complex web of issues with no obvious remedy. Ford's traditional tools, scale, brand loyalty, and huge pockets were no longer adequate in a globe quickly reconfiguring itself in reaction to assertive nationalism and economic fragmentation. The drop in overseas demand had a knock-on impact that wrecked Ford's product diversification strategy. For years, Ford relied on a portfolio of models that catered to various regional preferences. These perfectly tailored goods had now become financial liabilities. Developing region-specific models necessitated significant investment, which made sense only if they could be marketed at scale across large markets. Tariffs shattered that equation, forcing Ford to face the grim reality that most of its R&D spending had become a sunk expense with little expectation of return. This gloomy reality permeated the company's innovation stream. Ambitious initiatives, including improved electric drivetrains, cutting-edge infotainment systems, and next-generation safety technology, came under intense examination. Senior management had to prioritize ruthlessly, dismissing promising technologies merely because the company could not afford to take them to market. Engineers and designers discovered that their work had been unexpectedly canceled or delayed indefinitely, causing dissatisfaction and a sense of hopelessness that spread like a plague across departments. Another layer of difficulty was the fierce rivalry from international automakers, particularly those based in countries not affected by American tariffs. Japanese, Korean, and European automakers quickly exploited Ford's flaws. They actively pushed into areas that Ford was now struggling to serve, delivering comparable models without the exorbitant prices associated with U.S. manufacturing under tariff penalties. In markets such as Germany, Brazil, and South Korea, Ford dealerships saw a dramatic drop in foot traffic, and customer loyalty eroded as competitors offered better offers and speedier availability. In the United States, where Ford still had a loyal customer base, the company's ability to sustain that loyalty was badly hampered by another unanticipated result of the tariffs: declining quality control. As Ford attempted to cut costs in order to stay afloat, it increasingly outsourced component production to less expensive contractors that were frequently ill-equipped to fulfill Ford's established standards. This cost-cutting tactic resulted in a surge in product failures, recalls, and customer unhappiness, further degrading a brand that had previously prided itself on durability and dependability. Behind the scenes, Ford's legal teams were completely overwhelmed. Trade compliance became a daily struggle as customs laws changed unexpectedly from nation to country. The legal costs of managing these complications rose gradually, depleting funds that could have been spent for marketing, innovation, or labor retention. Ford's lawyers also braced for a slew of lawsuits, from dealerships facing bankruptcy, suppliers left hanging, and perhaps stockholders outraged by what they claimed was mismanagement of the unfolding issue. Meanwhile, strategic conversations began to emerge at the board level concerning Ford's ability to remain independent at all. Investment bankers, ever opportunistic, began approaching the board with unsolicited merger, acquisition, and breakup proposals. Some speculated that Ford could find salvation by partnering with a larger technology company wanting to enter the automotive industry. Others advocated for the sale of non-core divisions to raise much-needed funds. Within Ford's leadership, these ideas sparked a mix of fascination and fear. No one enjoyed the prospect of losing Ford's tightly guarded autonomy, but the financial maths was becoming too difficult to ignore. Internal morale plummeted to dangerously low levels. The once proud Ford culture, built on a century of endurance and creativity, frayed under the constant barrage of bad news. Executives who had spent decades climbing through the ranks began discreetly retiring, refusing to observe the demolition of programs and initiatives to which they had dedicated their whole careers. Younger employees, many of whom had joined Ford because of its reputation for security and potential, began to search elsewhere for more promising careers in tech corporations, startups, or even competitors who appeared to be better positioned for survival. A less obvious but equally catastrophic issue arose in Ford's supply chain. Historically, Ford used considerable power over its suppliers, pressuring them for the cheapest costs and most efficient manufacturing schedules. Now those suppliers, facing their own survival issues, have begun to turn the tables. Some asked for price increases to offset their higher tariffs and material costs. Others renegotiated more favorable contract terms for themselves. A few just went bankrupt, forcing Ford to scramble for replacements and incurring delays throughout the manufacturing process. The difficulties affected Ford's brand equity as well. The Ford name, previously associated with American invention and perseverance, began to have negative connotations in some areas. Foreign media narratives switched from depicting Ford as a daring inventor to presenting it as a cautionary tale of corporate hubris and government foolishness. Ford's advertising initiatives performed poorly in Southeast Asia and parts of Europe. No amount of brilliant marketing could make up for the harsh economic reality that shoppers faced when glancing at sticker pricing. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our channel. Also, please leave your comments and let us know. What are your opinions on Ford CEO Jim Farley's statement regarding the company's financial struggles? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.